Hello, welcome to the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service. Today we're taking you back to the 1980s when deaf children in Nicaragua invented a brand new sign language of their own. It gave experts a unique insight into how human communication develops. In 2020, Mike Lanchin spoke to American linguist Judy Shepard-Keggel, who documented this process.
My little linguist brain, looking at them signing to each other, was going, okay, this is happening, this is that rule, this is what's happening with the grammar. You could see the ease of communication, you could see the understanding that they all understood each other.
In the mid-1980s, American linguist Judy Shepard-Keggel was standing in a playground full of deaf children in Managua, Nicaragua, when she witnessed an exciting and enthralling development. The deaf youngsters were inventing their own sign language.
And I realized, whoa, we are seeing the emergence of a language. This was something that needed to be documented. The emergence of new languages is not unknown, but it's never been the case that someone has actually been able to film, document, and follow the process of what the human brain is doing with language.
But how and why did a new sign language emerge from this tiny, impoverished Central American country? In 1979, Nicaragua underwent a huge change as left-wing Sandinista rebels ended decades of rule by the brutal Somoza dictatorship. The new revolutionary government had an agenda of education for all and sent students out into the countryside to teach the peasants to read and write. But also Nicaragua's disparate deaf community was for the first time offered the chance of vocational training and schooling.
Deaf children prior to the 1980s were extremely isolated. They were isolated from language, and they were isolated from the community. All they had was a handful of gestures. They maybe had 5 to 10 gestures, something like, I want to eat, or I have to go to the bathroom. I mean, just gestures that were used in the family. And certainly there were very, very few deaf people who had ever seen another deaf person.
Young deaf Nicaraguans were isolated and largely living at home, like this young man who spoke to the BBC about growing up in the 1970s before the Sandinista revolution.
Sometimes, how can I put it? I waved my hands around, but it wasn't signing. You would have thought me a bit crazy with all my wild gestures. Even with my family, one-to-one, if I wanted something, or like an ice cream, I had to show them the man with the trolley and point. Then my father would understand and get one for me.
But in the early 1980s, under the new government, it was youngsters like him who suddenly had the chance to interact with other deaf children at special schools opened up in the capital and in other major cities.
So when the children showed up in the schools, when the children got on buses with each other, when the children were on the playground with each other, what they came with was a bag of, not signs, a bag of gestures. And they suddenly had the need to communicate.
The school brought in teachers from East Germany to try to teach the students to lip read. But it was a dismal failure, as they simply didn't understand what was going on. However, between the students themselves, something startling had begun to happen. They were finding their own way to communicate.
And that way of communicating was firstly by gestures, and then using their own very simple set of signs.
The students had started signing to each other, and their signing developed so fast that it was soon too complicated for the teachers to follow by guesswork.
And so the teachers asked for more help, this time from experts like American Judy Shepard-Keggel. Judy first arrived in Nicaragua in 1986.
I asked the teachers, what do you want from me? They looked at these kids on this little cement basketball court, pointed over to them waving their hands at each other, and said, we want to understand what they're talking about.
Judy agreed to help out. But when she tried to figure out what the children's unusual signing meant, she was initially confused.
I saw a communication that was happening that was very hard for me as a linguist to get a handle on. I was thinking I was looking at a language, and when I delved into it to try to look at its rule system and its vocabulary and all the rest, I could get vocabulary. That's easy. That's really not language. But when you looked for what the sentence structure was, each person was different. There was a lot of variability.
But Judy persisted. She went across town to another school for younger deaf students, and there she came across a group who'd taken their original gestures even further. Some of the kids were now developing a grammar structure, part of what would eventually become Nicaraguan Sign Language.
In the group of young people that we saw on the playground, there was one very dominant language user named Mayela. And Mayela started to explain how the school worked, what she did, what kinds of classes she took.
We're all deaf here and we've grown up together. As you can see, we're all good friends. Everyone is learning to write. They also try to teach us to speak. Over there they teach typing. If we can type, we can get a good job when we leave school in August.
As I watched her, I saw the sort of full-blown consistency, the facial expression, the rhythm, the assurance of being understood, the grammar. I was seeing just grammar coming at me. And the same was true for all the kids around her.
For Judy and her colleagues, it was a unique opportunity to study a new sign language as it actually emerged.
We devised a simple task using a 1.5-minute long non-verbal cartoon, no words, and looked at how anyone who was deaf would recount the contents of that cartoon. And what we discovered was that the younger kids had a lot more of a grammatical repertoire to use. The younger the time at which the child was exposed to other deaf people around them communicating, the younger they were, the more fluent we saw their recounting of these cartoons to be.
And that, says Judy, was further proof that there's a cut-off point, what experts call the critical period, beyond which our ability to learn a new language can suddenly drop off. But the Nicaraguan experience also shed light on an ongoing debate among linguists about whether language is part of the human endowment, like vision or puberty, that will eventually happen, or is it something that's out there in the environment that has to be learned, like riding a bike? Is it nature or nurture?
I believe that it is nature, but it needs company. You need to have that reason to use language, which is why the deaf people left in their homes with just a gesture who never have to use language don't get the triggers that have them develop language. They remain languageless. So that's another piece that the Nicaragua story has brought back home to me.
Judy's still in touch with many of those students who first developed what's now internationally recognised as Nicaraguan Sign Language. And along with her husband, she continues to support schools for the deaf in Nicaragua.
We did not go in and make it happen. We documented something that was happening. If we did anything, we shared a respect for the complexity and the value of the language that they gave birth to. But they did the rest.
Judy Shepherd-Keckle was speaking to Mike Lanchin in 2020 for the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service. She is now Professor of Linguistics at the University of Southern Maine in the United States. If you've enjoyed listening, why not leave us a review? And please share it with anyone you think would like to hear it. It really helps in letting people know about the amazing stories people tell us on Witness History.